The congratulations were over. As the visitors who had met at court went away, they talked about the latest news of the day, the rewards that had been bestowed, and the changed positions of some high functionaries. "What should you say if the Countess Marya Borissovna was made Minister of War, and the Princess Vatkovskaya Chief of Staff?" asked a little, gray-haired old man in a gold-embroidered uniform, who was talking with a tall, handsome maid of honor about the recent changes. "In that case I should be made one of the Emperor's aides," replied the Karenina. "Your place is already settled. You are to have charge of the Department of Religions, and Karenin is to be your assistant." "How do you do, Prince?" said the little old man, shaking hands with someone who came along. "Were you speaking of Karenin?" asked the prince. "Yes, he and Putyatov have been decorated with the Order of Alexander Nevsky." "I thought he had it already." "No, look at him," said the little old man, pointing with his gold-laced hat toward Karenin, who was standing in the doorway, talking with one of the influential members of the Imperial Council. He wore the court uniform, with his new red ribbon across his shoulder. "Happy and contented as a copper kopeck," he added, pausing to press the hand of a handsome, athletic chamberlain passing by. "No, he has grown old," said the chamberlain. "With cares. He spends all his time writing projects. He, the unfortunate man, will not let go until he has explained everything point by point." "What? Grown old? Il faut de patience. I think the Countess Lydia is jealous now of his wife." "There, I beg you not to speak ill of the Countess Lydia." "Is there any harm in her being in love with Karenin?" "Is it true that Madame Karenin is here?" "Not here, at the palace, but in Petersburg. I met her yesterday with Alexey Vronsky, bras dessus, bras dessous, on the Morskaya." "C'est un homme qu'on ne pas," began the chamberlain, but he broke off short to salute and make way for a member of the imperial family who was passing. Thus they were talking about Alexey Alexandrovitch, criticizing and ridiculing him, while he himself was barring the way of the imperial counselor, and, without pausing in his explanations lest he should lose him, was giving a detailed exposition of a financial scheme. Alexey Alexandrovitch, about the time his wife left him, had reached a situation painful for an official, the culmination of his upward career. This culmination had been reached, and all clearly saw it, but Alexey Alexandrovitch himself was not yet aware that his career was ended. Either his collision with Stremov, or his trouble with his wife, or the simple fact that Alexey Alexandrovitch had reached the limit that he had been destined to attain, the fact remained that everyone saw clearly that his official race was run. He still held an important place, he was a member of many important committees and commissions, but he was one of those men of whom nothing more is expected. His day was over. Whatever he said, whatever he proposed, seemed antiquated and useless. But Alexey Alexandrovitch himself did not realize this. On the contrary, now that he had ceased to have an active participation in the business of the administration, he saw more clearly than before the faults and mistakes that others were making, and considered it his duty to indicate certain reforms which should be introduced. Shortly after his separation from his wife, he began to write his first pamphlet about the new tribunals, and proposed to follow it up with an endless series of similar pamphlets, of no earthly use, on all the different branches of the administration. He not only did not realize his hopeless situation in the official world, and therefore did not lose heart, but more than ever he took delight in his activity. "He that is unmarried is careful for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married is careful for the things of the world, how he may please his wife," said the Apostle Paul. And Alexey Alexandrovitch, who now directed his life in all respects according to the epistle, often quoted this text. It seemed to him that, since he had been deprived of his wife, he served the Lord more faithfully than ever by devotion to these projects. The imperial councillor's very manifest impatience and desire to get away from him in no way abashed Karenin, but he stopped a moment as a prince of the imperial family was passing, and his victim seized his opportunity to escape. Left to himself, Alexey Alexandrovitch bowed his head, tried to collect his thoughts, and, with an absent-minded glance about him, stepped toward the door, hoping to meet the countess there. "How strong and healthy they look physically," he said to himself, as he looked at the vigorous neck of the prince, who wore a close-fitting uniform, and the handsome chamberlain, with his well-combed and perfumed side-whiskers. It is only too true that all is evil in this world, he thought, as he looked at the chamberlain's sturdy legs. Moving slowly along, Alexey Alexandrovitch, with his customary appearance of weariness and dignity, came up to the gentleman who had been talking about him, and glancing through the door, he looked for the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. "Ah, Alexey Alexandrovitch!" cried the little old man, with a wicked light growing in his eyes as Karenin passed him with a cold bow. "I have not yet congratulated you," and he pointed to the newly received ribbon. "I thank you. This is a fine day," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, accenting the adjective prekrasny, as was his habit. He knew that these gentlemen were making sport of him, but he expected nothing but hostile feelings, and he was accustomed to it. Catching the sight of the countess's yellow shoulders rising from her corsage as she appeared at the door, and her beautiful pensive eyes inviting him to join her, Alexey Alexandrovitch, with the smile which showed his even white teeth, went to her. Lidia Ivanovna's toilet had cost her much labor, like all her recent efforts in this direction, for the object of her toilet was now entirely the reverse of that which she had followed 30 years before. Formerly she had thought only of adorning herself, and the more the better. Now, on the contrary, she had to be adorned so unsuitably for her figure and her years that she simply endeavored to render the contrast between her person and her toilet not too frightful. And in Alexey Alexandrovitch's eyes she succeeded. He thought her fascinating. For him she, with the friendliness and even love for him, was the only island amid the sea of animosity and ridicule that surrounded him. As he was the gauntlet of scornful glances, he was naturally drawn to her loving eyes like a plant toward the light. "I congratulate you," she said, looking at his decoration. Repressing a smile of satisfaction, Karenin shrugged his shoulders and half closed his eyes, as if to say that this was nothing to him. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna knew well that these distinctions, even though he would not confess it, caused him the keenest pleasure. "How is our angel?" she said, referring to Seroza. "I cannot say that I am very well satisfied with him," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, lifting his eyebrows and opening his eyes. "And Sitnikov, a pedagogue who had been entrusted with Seroza's childish education, does not please him. As I told you, I find in him a certain apathy toward the chief questions which ought to move the soul of every man and of every child." And Alexey Alexandrovitch began to discourse on a subject which, next to the question of administration, gave him the most concern: his son's education. When Alexey Alexandrovitch, with Lidia Ivanovna's aid, once more resumed his ordinary life and activity again, he felt it his duty to occupy himself with the education of the son who had been left on his hands. Having never before taken any practical interest in the question of education, Alexey Alexandrovitch consecrated some time to the practical study of the subject. After having read various works on anthropology, pedagogy, and didactics, he conceived a plan of education which the best tutor in Petersburg was then entrusted to put into practice. And this work constantly occupied him. "Yes, but his heart. I find in this child his father's heart, and with such a heart he cannot be bad," said the countess with enthusiasm. "Well, that may be. So far as in me lies, I perform my duty. It is all I can do." "Will you come to my house?" asked the Countess Lidia Ivanovna, after a moment's silence. "I have a very painful matter to talk with you about. I would have given the world to spare you certain memories. Others do not think the same. I had a letter from her. She is here in Petersburg." Alexey Alexandrovitch quivered at the recollection of his wife, but his face instantly assumed that expression of corpse-like immobility that showed how absolutely unable he was to treat of such a subject. "I expected it," he said. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna looked at him with exultation, and in the presence of a soul so great, tears of transport sprang to her eyes. When Alexey entered the Countess Lidia Ivanovna's cozy little boudoir, decorated with portraits and old porcelains, he failed to find his friend. She was changing her gown. On a round table covered with a cloth stood a Chinese tea service and a silver teapot with an alcohol lamp. Alexey Alexandrovitch glanced perfunctorily at the numberless paintings that adorned the room. Then he sat down near a table and took up a copy of the New Testament which lay on it. The rustling of the countess's silk dress put his thoughts to flight. "Well now, we can be a little more free from disturbance," said the countess, with a smile, gliding between the table and the divan. "We can talk while drinking our tea." After several words, meant to prepare his mind, she sighed deeply, and, with a tinge of colour in her cheeks, she put Anna's letter into his hands. He read it, and sat long in silence. "I do not feel that I have the right to refuse her," he said timidly, raising his eyes. "My friend, you can never see evil anywhere." "On the contrary, I see everything as evil. But would it be fair to—" His face expressed indecision, desire for advice, for support, for guidance, in a question so beyond his comprehension. "No," interrupted the Countess Lidia Ivanovna, "there are limits to things. I understand immorality," she said, not with absolute sincerity, since she did not know what could induce women to be immoral. "But what I do not understand is cruelty toward anyone, toward you. How can she remain in the same city with you? One is never too old to learn, and I learn every day your grandeur and her baseness." "Who shall cast the first stone?" asked Alexey Alexandrovitch, evidently satisfied with the part he was playing. "I have forgiven her for everything, and therefore I cannot deprive her of what is a need of her heart, her love for her son." "But is it love, my friend? Is it sincere? Let us agree that you have forgiven her, and that you still pardon her. But have we the right to vex the soul of this little angel? He believes that she is dead. He prays for her, and asks God to pardon her sins. It is better so. What would he think now?" "I had not thought of that," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, perceiving the justice of her words. The countess covered her face with her hands and was silent. She was praying. "If you ask my advice," she replied, after she had uttered her prayer and taken her hands from her face, "you will do this. Do I not see how you suffer, how this opens all your wounds? But let us admit that you, as always, forget yourself. But where will it lead you? New sufferings for yourself, to torture for the child. If she were still capable of human feelings, she herself could not desire this. No, I have no hesitation about it. I advise you not to, and, if you give me your authority, I will reply to her." Alexey Alexandrovitch consented, and the countess wrote in French this letter: "Chère Madame, recalling your existence to your son would be likely to raise questions which it would be impossible to answer without obliging the child to criticize that which should remain sacred to him, and therefore I beg you to interpret your husband's refusal in the spirit of Christian charity. I pray the Omnipotent to be merciful to you. Comtesse Lydia." This letter accomplished the secret aim which the countess would not confess even to herself. It wounded Anna to the bottom of her soul. Alexey Alexandrovitch, on returning home from Lidia Ivanovna's, found himself unable to take up his ordinary occupations, or recover the spiritual calm of a believer who feels that he is among the elect. The thought of his wife who had been so guilty toward him, and toward whom he had acted so like a saint, as the Countess Lidia Ivanovna had so well expressed it, ought not to have disturbed him, and yet he was ill at ease. He could not understand a word of the book he was reading. He could not drive away from his mind the cruel recollections of his relations to her, of the mistakes which, as it now seemed to him, he himself had made in his treatment of her. He remembered with a feeling like remorse the way he had received Anna's confession that day when they were returning from the races. Why had he demanded merely an outward observance of the proprieties? Why had he not challenged Vronsky to a duel? He was likewise tormented by his recollection of the letter which he wrote her at that time, especially his forgiveness of her, which had proved useless to anyone, and the pains which he had wasted on the baby that was not his, all came back to his memory and seared his heart with shame and regret. And exactly the same feeling of shame and regret she experienced now in reviewing all his past with her, and remembering the awkward way in which, after long vacillating, he had offered himself to her. "But how am I at fault?" he asked himself, and this question immediately gave rise to another. Do other men feel differently, fall in love differently, and marry differently? These Vronskys, Oblonskys, these chamberlains with their handsome calves, His imagination called up a whole line of these vigorous men, self-confident and strong, who had always and everywhere attracted his curiosity and his wonder. He drove away these thoughts. He strove to persuade himself that the end and aim of his life was not this world, but eternity, that peace and charity alone ought to dwell in his soul. But the fact that in this temporal, insignificant life he had, as it seemed to him, made some humiliating blunders, tortured him as much as if that eternal salvation in which he put his trust did not exist. But this temptation was not long, and soon Alexey Alexandrovitch regained that serenity and elevation of mind by which he succeeded in putting away all that he wished to forget. "Well, Kapitanuitch," said Seroza, as he came in, rosy and gay, after his walk, on the evening before his birthday, while the old Swiss, smiling down from his superior height, helped the young man off with his coat. "Did the bandaged tchinovnik come to-day? Did papa see him?" "Yes. The manager had only just got here when I announced him," replied the Swiss, winking one eye gaily. "Permit me, I will take it." "Seroza! Seroza!" cried the Slavophil tutor, who was standing by the door that led to the inner rooms. "Take off your coat by yourself." But Seroza, though he heard his tutor's weak voice, paid no heed to him. Standing by the Swiss, he held him by the belt and looked him straight in the face. "And did papa do what he wanted?" The Swiss nodded. This tchinovnik, with his head in a bandage, who had come 7 times to ask some favor of Alexey Alexandrovitch, interested Seroza and the Swiss. Seroza had met him one day in the vestibule, and overheard how he begged the Swiss to let him be admitted, saying that nothing was left for him and his children but to die. Since that time the lad had felt great concern for the poor man. "Say, did he seem very glad?" asked Seroza. "Glad as he could be. He went off almost leaping." "Has anything come?" asked Seroza, after a moment's silence. "Well, sir," whispered the Swiss, shaking his head, "there is something from the countess." Seroza instantly understood that what the Swiss meant was a birthday present from the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. "What is it? Where is it?" "Kornei took it to papa. It must be some beautiful toy." "How big? As big as this?" "Smaller, but beautiful." "A little book?" "No, a toy. Run away, run away. Vasily Lukitch is calling you," said the Swiss, hearing the tutor's steps approach, and gently removing the little gloved hand which held his belt. "In a bit of a moment, Vasily Lukitch," said Seroza, with the amiable and gracious smile to whose influence even the stern tutor submitted. Seroza was in radiant spirits, and wanted to tell his friend, the Swiss, about a piece of good fortune which the Countess Lidia Ivanovna's niece had told him, while they were walking in the summer garden, had befallen the family. His happiness seemed greater still since he heard about the tchinovnik's success and his present. It seemed to Seroza that everyone ought to be happy this beautiful day. "Do you know, papa has received the Alexander Nevsky order?" "Why shouldn't I know? He has been receiving congratulations." "Is he glad?" "How could he help being glad of the Tsar's favor? Of course he deserves it," said the old Swiss gravely. Seroza reflected as he looked into the Swiss's face, which he knew even to the least detail, but especially the chin between his gray side whiskers. No one had seen his chin except Seroza, who looked up at it from below. "Well, and your daughter? Isn't it a long time since she has been to see us?" The Swiss's daughter was a ballet dancer. "How could she find time to come on work days?" he exclaimed. "They have their lessons as well as you, and you had better be off to yours, sir." When Seroza reached his room, instead of attending to his tasks, he poured out into the tutor's ears all his surmises about the present which had been brought him. "It must be a locomotive engine. What do you think about it?" he asked. But Vasily Lukitch was thinking of nothing except the grammar lesson, which had to be ready for the professor, who came at 2 o'clock. "No, but you must just tell me one thing, Vasily Lukitch," asked the child, who was now sitting at his desk with his book in his hands. "What is there higher than the Alexander Nevsky? You know that papa has just received the Alexander Nevsky." Vasily Lukitch replied that the Order of Vladimir was higher. And above that? St. Andrew above them all. And above that? I don't know. Why don't you know? And Seroza, leaning his head on his hand, began to think. The child's thoughts were very varied and complicated. He imagined that his father perhaps was going to have the orders of Vladimir and St. Andrew, and that therefore he would be the more indulgent for that day's lessons, and that he himself, when he grew up, would do his best to deserve all the decorations, even those that would be given higher than that of St. Andrew. A new order would scarcely have time to be founded before he would make himself worthy of it. These thoughts made the time pass so quickly that, when the professor came, his lesson about the circumstances of time and place and mode of action was not prepared at all, and the professor seemed not only dissatisfied but distressed. His professor's distress touched Seroza. He felt that he was to blame for not having learned his lesson. In spite of all his efforts, he really had been unable to do it. When the professor was talking to him, he imagined that he understood, but when he was alone, he really could not remember or comprehend that such a short and easy word as "vdrug" suddenly is a circumstance of the mode of action. But still he was sorry that he had tried his teacher. He seized on a moment when his teacher was silently looking into a book to ask him, "Mikhail Ivanovitch, when will your birthday be?" "You would better to think about your work. Birthdays have no importance for a reasonable being. It is only a day just like any other, and must be spent in work." Seroza looked attentively at his teacher, studied his sparse beard, his eye-glasses far down on his nose, and got into such a deep brown study that he heard nothing of what the teacher was explaining to him. He had a dim comprehension that his teacher did not believe what he said. By the tone in which he said it, he felt that it was incredible. "But why do they all try to say to me the most tiresome things, and the most useless things, and all in the same way? Why does this man keep me from him, and not love me?" he asked himself sadly, and he could not discover any answer. After the professor came the lesson with his father. Seroza, while waiting for him, sat at the table, playing with his penknife, and he fell into new thoughts. One of his favorite occupations was to look for his mother while he was out walking. He did not believe in death as a general thing, and especially he did not believe that his mother was dead, in spite of what the Countess Lidia Ivanovna told him, and though his father confirmed it. And therefore, after they told him that she was dead, he used to watch for her while he was out for his walk. Every tall, graceful woman with dark hair he imagined to be his mother. At the sight of such a woman, his heart would swell with love, the tears would come into his eyes, and he would wait until the lady drew near him, and raised her veil. Then he would see her face. She would kiss him, smile upon him, he would feel the sweet caress of her hand, smell the well-known perfume, and weep with joy, as he did one evening when he lay at her feet, and she tickled him, and he laughed so heartily, and gently bit her white hand, covered with rings. Later, when he learned accidentally from the old nurse that his mother was alive, and that his father and the countess had told him that she was dead because she was a wicked woman, this seemed still more impossible to Seroza, because he loved her, and he looked for her, and longed for her. That very day, in the summer garden, there had been a lady in a lilac veil, and, with his heart beating violently, expecting that it was she, he saw her take the same footpath where he was walking. But this lady did not come up to where he was, and she disappeared from sight. Seroza felt a stronger love than ever for his mother, and now, while waiting for his father, he was cutting his desk with his penknife. With shining eyes, he was looking straight ahead and thinking of her. "Here comes your papa," said Vasily Lukitch. Seroza jumped up from the chair, ran to kiss his father's hand, and looked for some sign of pleasure because he had received the order of Alexander Nevsky. "Did you have a good walk?" asked Alexey Alexandrovitch, as he sat down in an armchair, taking up the Old Testament and opening it. Though he had often told Seroza that every Christian ought to know the sacred history by heart, he had often to consult the Old Testament for his lessons, and Seroza noticed it. "Yes, papa, I enjoyed it very much," said Seroza, sitting across his chair and tipping it, which was forbidden. "I saw Nadenka." Nadenka was the countess's niece, whom she adopted. "And she told me that they've given you a new star. Are you glad, papa?" "In the first place, please don't tip your chair so," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "And in the second place, know that what ought to be dear to us is work for itself, and not the reward. I want you to understand that. If you work and study simply for the sake of receiving the recompense, the work will seem painful. But if you love work, your recompense will come of itself." And Alexey Alexandrovitch remembered that on this very day he had signed 118 different papers, with no other support in a most unwelcome task than the feeling of duty. Serosa's eyes, shining with affection and merriment, grew gloomy and dropped as his father looked at him. It was the same well-remembered way his father had adopted in his treatment of him, and Serosa had already schooled himself to be hypocritical toward it. He felt that his father always spoke as if he were addressing some imaginary boy, one of those children found in books, and not in the least like Serosa. And Serosa, when he was with his father, tried to make believe that he was that bookish little boy. "You understand this, I hope?" "Yes, papa," replied the lad, playing the part of this imaginary little boy. The lesson consisted of the recitation of several verses of the Gospel and the review of the first part of the Old Testament. The verses from the Gospel Serosa knew fairly well, but, as he was in the midst of so repeating them, Serosa was struck by the appearance of his father's forehead, which made almost a right angle near the temples, and he stumbled and transferred the end of one verse to the next verse, which began with the same word. Alexey Alexandrovitch concluded that he did not understand the meaning of what he was reciting, and he was vexed. He frowned, and began to explain what Serosa had heard so many times that he could not help remembering because he understood it too well, just as it was with the concept of the word "vdrung," suddenly, being a circumstance of the mode of action. The child, with scared eyes, looked at his father and thought about only one thing. Would his father oblige him to repeat the explanation that he had given him as he had done at other times? This fear kept him from understanding anything. Fortunately his father passed on to the lesson in sacred history. Serosa narrated the facts themselves very well, but when he was required to answer the question as to what the fact signified, he did not know it at all, though he had already been punished for this same lesson. The place where he could not recite and hesitated, and where he had whittled the table and rocked the chair, was the critical moment when he had to repeat the list of antediluvian patriarchs. Not one could he remember, not even Enoch, who was snatched up to heaven alive. On other occasions he could remember his name, but now he had entirely forgotten it, for the very reason that Enoch was his favorite character in all biblical history, and he connected with the translation of this patriarch a long string of ideas which completely absorbed him, while he was staring at his father's watch chain and a loose button on his waistcoat. Serosa absolutely disbelieved in death, though they had told him about it many times. He could not believe that those whom he loved could die, and especially incredible was the thought of his own death. It all seemed perfectly impossible and incomprehensible. But he had been told that all must die. He had asked people in whom he had confidence, and they had assured him that it was so. The nurse herself, though unwillingly, said the same thing. But Enoch did not die, and perhaps others might not have to die. Why should not others deserve justice before God, and so be snatched up to heaven alive? Thought Serosa. The wicked, those whom he disliked, might have to die, but the good might be like Enoch. Well, how about these patriarchs? Enoch. Enos. You have already mentioned him. This is bad, Serosa, very bad. If you do not endeavor to learn the things essential for every Christian to know, what will become of you? Asked his father, getting up. I am dissatisfied with you, and Pyotr Ignatyevitch, he was the professor, is dissatisfied with you, so I am compelled to punish you. Father and Pedagogu both found fault with him, and Serosa was doubtless making bad work of it. Yet it could not possibly be said that he was a stupid boy. On the contrary, he was far superior to those whom his teacher held up to him as examples. From his father's point of view, he did not want to learn what was taught him. In reality, it was because he could not learn it. He could not for the reason that his mind had needs more essential to him than those that his father and the pedagogue supposed. These needs were wholly opposed to what they gave him, and he revolted against his teachers. He was only 9 years old. He was only a child. But he knew his own soul. It was dear to him. He guarded it jealously, as the eyelid guards the eye. And no one should force a way in without the key of love. His teachers blamed him for being unwilling to learn, and yet he was all on fire with the yearning for knowledge. And he learned from Kapitonowitch, his old nurse, Nadenka, and Vasily Lukitch, but not from his teachers. The water which the father and the pedagogue poured into the mill wheel was wasted, but the work was done in another place. His father punished Seroza by not letting him go to see Nadenka, but his punishment turned out to be an advantage. Vasily Lukitch was in good humor and taught him how to make windmills. The whole afternoon was spent in working and thinking of ways and means to make the mill go. Should he fix wings to it, or arrange it so he could turn it himself? He forgot about his mother all the evening, but after he had got to bed he suddenly remembered her, and he prayed in his own fashion that she might cease to hide herself from him and make him a visit the next day, which was his birthday. "Vasily Lukitch, do you know what I prayed God for?" "To study better?" "No." "Toys?" "No. You must not guess. It is a secret. When it comes to pass, I will tell you. Can't you guess?" "No, I can't guess. You must tell me," said Vasily Lukitch, smiling, which was rare with him. "Well, get into bed. I'm going to put out the light." "I see that which I prayed for much better when there isn't any light. There, I almost told my secret," cried Seroza, laughing gaily. Seroza believed that he heard his mother and felt her presence when he was in the dark. She was standing near him and looking at him tenderly with her loving eyes. Then he saw a mill, a knife, then all melted into darkness, and he was asleep. When Vronsky and Anna reached Petersburg, they stopped at one of the best hotels. Vronsky had a room to himself on the ground floor. Anna, up one flight of stairs, with her baby, the nurse, and her maid, occupied a suite of 4 rooms. On the day of his return, Vronsky went to see his brother. He there found his mother, who had come down from Moscow on business. His mother and sister-in-law received him as usual, asked him about his travels, spoke of common friends, but not by a word did they make any allusion to Anna. His brother, however, who returned his call the next morning, asked him about her and Alexei. Vronsky declared in no equivocal terms that he considered the bond which united him to Madame Karenina the same as marriage, that he hoped a divorce would be obtained, and then he should marry her, but till that time he should regard her the same as his wife, and he asked him to explain this to his mother and sister-in-law. "The world may not approve of me, that is all one to me," he added, "but if my family wish to remain on good terms with me, they must show proper respect for my wife." The elder brother, always very respectful of his brother's opinions, was not very certain in his own mind whether he was doing right or not, and resolved to let society settle this question. But, as far as he himself was concerned, he saw nothing objectionable in this, and he went with Alexei to call on Anna. Vronsky spoke to Anna with the formal vous, you, as he always did before strangers, and treated her as a mere acquaintance, but it was perfectly understood that the brother knew of their relations, and they spoke freely of Anna's visit to Vronsky's estate. Notwithstanding his experience in society, Vronsky, in consequence of this new state of things, fell into a strange error. It would seem as if he ought to have understood that society would shut its doors on him and Anna, but now he persuaded himself by a strange freak of imagination that, however it might have been in former days, now, owing to the rapid progress made by society, and he had himself unconsciously become a strong supporter of progress, prejudices would have melted away, and the question whether they would be received by society would not trouble them. Of course, she would not be received at court, he thought, but our relatives, our friends, will understand things as they are. A man may sit for some time with his legs doubled up in one position, provided he knows that he can change it at pleasure. But if he knows that he must sit in such a constrained position, then he will feel cramped, and his legs will twitch and stretch out toward the desired freedom. Vronsky experienced this in regard to society. Though he knew in the bottom of his soul that society was closed to them, he made experiment whether it had changed, and whether it would receive them. But he quickly found that, even if it were open to him personally, it was closed to Anna. As in the game of cat and mouse, the hands raised for him immediately fell before Anna. One of the first ladies of Petersburg society whom he met was his cousin Betsy. "At last!" she cried joyously. "And Anna, how glad I am! Where are you stopping? I can easily imagine the hideous effect our Petersburg must have on you after such a charming journey. And I can imagine your honeymoon in Rome. And the divorce, is it arranged?" Vronsky saw that Betsy's enthusiasm cooled when she learned that there was no divorce as yet. "I know well that I shall be stoned," said she, "but I am coming to see Anna. Yes, I will certainly come. You won't stay here long, I imagine?" In fact, she called on Anna that very day, but her manner was entirely different from what it used to be. She evidently prided herself on her courage, and wanted Anna to appreciate the genuineness of her friendship. After talking for about 10 minutes on the news of the day, she got up and said as she went away, "You have not told me yet when the divorce is to be. Though I may disregard the proprieties, stiff-necked people will give you the cold shoulder as long as you are not married. And it is so easy nowadays. C'est sa fête. Are you going Friday? I'm sorry we shall not see each other again." From Betsy's manner Vronsky might have got an idea of what he might expect from society. But he made still another experiment in his own family. He had no hope of any assistance from his mother. He knew well that, enthusiastic though she had been in Anna's praise at their first meeting, she would be relentless toward her now that she had spoiled her son's career. But Vronsky founded great hopes on Varya, his brother's wife. It seemed to him that she would not be one to cast a stone at Anna, but would come simply and naturally to see her. On the next day he called on her, and, finding her alone, he openly expressed his desire. "You know, Alexey, how fond I am of you," replied Varya, after hearing what he had to say, "and how willing I am to do anything for you. But if I kept silent, it is because I know that I cannot be of the least use to you and Anna Arkadyevna." She took special pains to use the two names. "Please don't think that I judge her. Not at all. Perhaps I should have done the same thing in her place. I cannot enter into details," she added, glancing timidly up at his clouded face. "But we must call things by their right name. You would like me to go and see her, and then have her visit me, in order to restore her to society. But you must know, I cannot do it. My daughters are growing up. I am obliged, on my husband's account, to go into society. Now, I will go and call on Anna Arkadyevna. But she knows that I cannot invite her here, lest she should meet in my drawing-room people who do not think as I do, and that would wound her. I cannot receive her." "But I do not admit that she has fallen lower than hundreds of women whom you receive," interrupted Vronsky, rising and seeing that his sister-in-law's decision was irrevocable. "Alexey, don't be angry with me. Please understand. It is not my fault," said Varya, looking at him with a timid smile. "I am not angry with you, but I suffer doubly," said he, growing more and more gloomy. "I suffer because this breaks our friendship, or, at least, seriously impairs it. For you must know that for me this could not be otherwise." He left her with these words. Vronsky understood that further experiments would be idle, and that, during the few days he would still have to spend in Petersburg, he must act as if he were in a foreign city, avoiding all dealings with his society friends, so as not to be subjected to vexations and affronts which were so painful to him. One of the most unpleasant features of his position in Petersburg was the fact that Alexey Alexandrovitch and his name seemed to be everywhere. It was impossible for a conversation to begin on any subject without turning on Alexey Alexandrovitch. It was impossible to go anywhere without meeting him. So at least it seemed to Vronsky. Just as it seems to a man with a sore finger, that he is always hitting it against everything. Their stay in Petersburg seemed to Vronsky still more trying because all the time he saw that Anna was in a strange, incomprehensible moral frame of mind such as he had never seen before. At one time she was more than usually affectionate. Then again she would seem cold, irritable, and enigmatical. Something was tormenting her, and she was concealing something from him, and she seemed not to notice the indignities which poisoned his life, and which, in her delicacy of perception, should have been even more painful for her. Anna's chief desire on her return to Russia was to see her son. From the day she left Italy, the thought of seeing him again kept her in a constant state of excitement, and in proportion as she drew near Petersburg, the prospective delight and importance of this meeting kept growing greater and greater. She did not trouble herself with the question how she should manage it. It would be a simple and natural thing, she thought, to see her son once more, when she would be in the same town with him. But since her arrival, she suddenly realized her present relation toward society, and found that the interview was not easy to obtain. She had been 2 days now in Petersburg, and never for an instant had the thought of her son left her, but she had not seen him. She felt that she had no right to go straight to her former home and risk coming face to face with Alexey Alexandrovitch. She might not be admitted. She might be insulted. To write to her husband and ask permission of him seemed to her painful even to think of. She could be calm only when she did not think of her husband. To see her son when he was out taking his walk, even if she could find where and when he went, was too little for her. She had counted so much on seeing him again. She had so much to say to him. She had such a desire to hug him, to kiss him. Serosa's old nurse might have been an assistance to her and shown her how to manage, but she was no longer living in Alexey Alexandrovitch's house. On the 3rd day, having learned of Alexey Alexandrovitch's intimate relations with the Countess Lidia Ivanovna, Anna decided to write her a letter, and this cost her the greatest pains to write. She told her frankly that permission to see her son depended on Alexey Alexandrovitch's magnanimity. She knew that if the letter were shown to her husband, he, in his part of magnanimous man, would not refuse her. The messenger that carried the letter brought back the most cruel and unexpected reply, that there was no answer. She had never felt so wounded as at the moment when, summoning the messenger, she heard from him the circumstantial story of how he had waited and how, after a time, he had been told that there would be no answer. Anna felt humiliated, insulted, but she saw that, from her point of view, the countess was right. Her grief was all the keener because she had to bear it alone. She could not and did not wish to confide it to Vronsky. She knew that though he was the chief cause of her unhappiness, he would regard her meeting with her son as of little account. She knew that he would never be able to sound all the depths of her anguish. She knew that she should hate him for the unsympathetic tone in which he would speak of it, and she feared this more than anything else in the world, and so hid from him her action in regard to her son. She stayed at home all day long and racked her brain to think of other ways of meeting her son, and finally she decided to write directly to her husband. She had already begun her letter when Lidia Ivanovna's reply was brought to her. The countess's previous silence had humbled and affronted her, but the note and all she read between the lines so exasperated her. This bitterness against her seemed so shocking when contrasted with her passionate, legitimate affection for her son, that she grew indignant against the others and ceased to blame herself. "What cruelty! What hypocrisy!" she said to herself. "All they want is to insult me and torment the child. I will not let them do so. She is worse than I am. At least, I do not lie." She immediately decided to go on the morrow, which was Serosa's birthday, directly to her husband's house. She would bribe the servants, and would make any kind of an excuse, if only she might once see her son and put an end to the ugly network of lies with which they were surrounding the innocent child. She went to a toy shop and purchased some toys, and thus she formed her plan of action. She would start early in the morning, at 8 o'clock, before Alexey Alexandrovitch would probably be up. She would have the money in her hand all ready to bribe the Swiss and the valet to let her go upstairs without raising her veil, under the pretext of laying on Serosa's bed some presents sent by his godfather. As to what she should say to her son, she could not form the least idea. She could not make any preparation for that. The next morning, at 8 o'clock, Anna got out of her hired carriage and rang the doorbell of her former home. "Go and see what is wanted. It's some lady," said Kapitonitch, in loose coat and galoshes, as he looked out of the window and saw a lady closely veiled standing on the porch. The Swiss's assistant, a young man whom Anna did not know, had scarcely opened the door before Anna pushed her way in and, drawing a 3-ruble note out of her muff, thrust it into his hand. "Serosa, Sergey Alexeyevitch," she stammered, and started down the vestibule. The Swiss's assistant examined the note and stopped the visitor at the inner glass door. "Whom do you wish to see?" he asked. She did not hear his words and made no reply. Kapitonitch, noticing the stranger's confusion, came out, led her into the entry, and asked her what she wanted. "I come from Prince Skorodumov to see Sergey Alexeyevitch." "He is not up yet," replied the Swiss, looking sharply at her. Anna never dreamed that the absolutely unchanged appearance of the anteroom of the house, which for 9 years had been her home, could have such a powerful effect on her. One after another, sweet and painful memories arose in her mind, and for a moment she forgot why she was there. "Will you wait?" asked the Swiss, helping her to remove her shubka. When he saw her face he recognized her, and without a word bowed profoundly. "Will your ladyship be pleased to enter?" he said to her. She tried to speak, but her voice refused to utter a sound. Giving the old servant an entreating look, with light, swift steps she went to the staircase. She flew up the stairs. Kapitonitch tried to overtake her, and followed after her, catching his galoshes at every step. "His tutor is here. Perhaps he is not dressed yet. I will speak to him." Anna kept on up the stairs which she knew so well, not heeding what the old man said. "This way. To the left, if you please. Excuse it if it is all disorder. He sleeps in the front room now," said the Swiss, out of breath. "Will your ladyship be good enough to wait a moment? I will go and see." And, opening the high door, he disappeared. Anna stopped and waited. "He has just waked up," said the Swiss, coming back through the same door. And as he spoke, Anna heard the sound of a child yawning, and merely by the sound of the yawn she recognized her son, and seemed to see him alive before her. "Let me go in, let me," she cried, and hurriedly pushed through the door. At the right of the door stood the bed, and on the bed a child was sitting up in his little open nightgown. His little body was leaning forward, and he was just finishing a yawn and stretching himself. His lips were just closing into a sleepy smile, and, with this smile, he slowly and gently fell back on his pillow. "Serosa," she whispered, as she went noiselessly toward him. At the time of their separation, and during that access of love which she had been recently experiencing for him, Anna had imagined him as still a boy of 4, the age when he had been the most charming. Now he no longer bore any resemblance to him whom she had left. He was still further removed from the 4-year-old ideal. He had grown taller and thinner. How long his face seemed, how short his hair, what long arms. How he had changed since she had seen him last. But it was still Serosa, the shape of his head, his lips, his little slender neck, his broad little shoulders. "Serosa," she whispered in the child's ear. He raised himself on his elbow, turned his disheveled head first to this side, then to that, as if searching for something, and opened his eyes. For several seconds he looked with an inquiring face at his mother, who stood motionless before him. Then he suddenly smiled with joy, and again closing his sleepy eyes, he threw himself, not back on his pillow, but into his mother's arms. "Serosa, my dear little boy," she cried, choking with tears, and throwing her arms around his plump body. "Mamma," he whispered, cuddling into his mother's arms so as to feel their encircling pressure. Smiling sleepily, still with his eyes closed, he took his chubby little hands from the head of the bed and put them on his mother's shoulder, and climbed into her lap, having that warm breath of sleep peculiar to children, and pressed his face to his mother's neck and shoulders. "I knew," he said, opening his eyes. "Today is my birthday. I knew that you would come. I am going to get up now." and as he spoke he fell asleep again. Anna devoured him with her eyes. She saw how he had grown and changed during her absence. She knew, and yet she did not know, his bare legs, so much longer now, coming below his nightgown. She recognized his cheeks grown thin, his short hair curled in the neck where she had often kissed it. She could not keep her hands from him, and not a word she was able to say, and the tears choked her. "What are you crying for, mamma?" he asked, now entirely awake. "What makes you cry?" he repeated, ready to weep himself. "I will not cry any more. I am crying for joy. It is so long since I have seen you. But I will not cry any more," she said, drying her tears and turning around. "Now go and get dressed," she added, after she had grown a little calmer, but still holding Serosa's hand. She sat down near the bed on a chair which held the child's clothing. "How do you dress without me? How—" She wanted to speak simply and gaily, but she could not, and again she turned her head away. "I do not wash in cold water any more. Papa has forbidden it. But you have not seen Vasily Lukitch? Here he comes. But you are sitting on my things." And Serosa laughed heartily. She looked at him and smiled. "Mamma, dear heart, darling," he cried, again throwing himself into her arms, as if now for the first time, having seen her smile, he clearly understood what had happened. "You don't need it on," said he, taking off her hat. And as if again recognizing her with her head bare, he began to kiss her again. "What do you think of me? Did you believe that I was dead? I never believed it." "You believed me alive, my precious." "I knew it! I knew it!" he replied, repeating his favorite phrase, and seizing her hand which was smoothing his hair, he pressed the palm of it to his little mouth and began to kiss it. Vasily Lukitch, meantime, not at first knowing who this lady was, but learning from their conversation that it was Serosa's mother, the woman who had deserted her husband, and whom he did not know, as he had not come into the house till after her departure, was in great perplexity. Ought he go to his pupil, or should he tell Alexey Alexandrovitch? On mature reflection he came to the conclusion that his duty consisted in going to dress Serosa at the usual hour, without paying any attention to a third person, his mother or anyone else. So he dressed himself. But as he reached the door and opened it, the sight of the caress between the mother and child, the sound of their voices and their words, made him change his mind. He shook his head, sighed, and quietly closed the door. "I will wait 10 minutes longer," he said to himself, coughing slightly and wiping his eyes. There was great excitement among the servants. They all knew that the Bryunya had come, and that Kapitonewitch had let her in, and that she was in the child's room. They knew, too, that their master was in the habit of going to Serosa every morning at 9 o'clock. Each one felt that the husband and wife ought not to meet, that it must be prevented. Kornei, the valet, went down to the Swiss to ask why Anna had been let in, and, finding that Kapitonewitch had taken her upstairs, he reprimanded him severely. The Swiss maintained an obstinate silence till the valet declared that he deserved to lose his place, when the old man jumped at him, and, shaking his fist in his face, said, "What is that? You would not let her in? You've served here 10 years and had nothing but kindness from her, but you would have said, 'No, go away from here.' You know what policy is, you sly dog. What you don't forget is to rob your master and carry off his raccoon-skin shubas." "Soldier," replied Kornei scornfully, and as he turned toward the nurse who was coming in just at this moment, "What do you think, Marya Yefimovna? He has let in Anna Arkadyevna without saying anything to anybody, and just when Alexey Alexandrovitch, as soon as he is up, will be going to the nursery." "What a scrape! What a scrape!" said the nurse. "But, Kornei Vasilievitch, find some way to keep your master, while I run to warn her and get her out of the way. What a scrape!" When the nurse went into the child's room, Serosa was telling his mother how Nadenka and he had fallen when sliding down a hill of ice, and turned 3 somersaults. Anna was listening to the sound of her son's voice, looking at his face, watching the play of his features, feeling his little arms, but not hearing a word that he said. She had to go away. She had to leave him. This alone she understood and felt. She had heard Vasily Lukitch's steps, and his little discreet cough as he came to the door, and now she heard the nurse coming in, but, unable to move or to speak, she remained as fixed as a statue. "Mistress, darling," said the nurse, coming up to Anna and kissing her hands and her shoulders, "God sent this joy for our birthday celebration. You are not changed at all." "Ah, nurse, my dear, I did not know that you were in the house," said Anna, coming to herself. "I don't live here. I live with my daughter. I came to give my best wishes to Seroza, Anna Arkadyevna. Golubushka." The nurse suddenly began to weep and to kiss Anna's hand. Seroza, with bright, joyful eyes, and holding his mother with one hand and his nurse with the other, was dancing in his little bare feet on the carpet. His old nurse's tenderness toward his mother was delightful to him. "Mamma, she often comes to see me, and when she comes," he began, but he stopped short when he perceived that the nurse whispered something in his mother's ear, and that his mother's face assumed an expression of fear, and something like shame which did not go well with his mother. Anna went to him. "My precious," she said. She could not say the word prashai, farewell, but the expression of her face said it, and he understood. "My precious, precious Kutik," she said, calling him by a pet name which she used when he was a baby. "You will not forget me. You—" But she could not say another word. Only then she began to think of the words which she wanted to say to him, but now it was impossible to say them. But Seroza understood all that she would have said. He understood that she was unhappy, and that she loved him. He even understood what the nurse whispered in her ear. He heard the words, "always at 9 o'clock," and he knew that they referred to his father, and that his mother must not meet him. He understood this, but one thing he could not understand. Why did her face express fear and shame? She was not to blame, but she was afraid of him, and seemed ashamed of something. He wanted to ask a question which would have explained this doubt, but he did not dare. He saw that she was in sorrow, and he pitied her. He silently clung close to her, and then he whispered, "Don't go yet. He will not come for some time." His mother pushed him away from her a little, in order to see if he understood the meaning of what he had said, and in the frightened expression of his face she perceived that he not only spoke of his father, but seemed to ask her how he ought to think about him. "Seroza, my dear," she said, "love him. He is better and more upright than I am, and I have been wicked to him. When you have grown up, you will understand." "Not better than you!" cried the child, with sobs of despair, and clinging to his mother's shoulders, he squeezed her with all his might till his arms trembled with the exertion. "My darling, my little one!" exclaimed Anna, and bursting into tears she sobbed like a child, even as he sobbed. At this moment the door opened, and Vasily Lukitch came in. Steps were heard at the other door, and in a frightened whisper he exclaimed, "He is coming," and gave Anna her hat. Seroza threw himself on the bed, sobbing, and covered his face with his hands. Anna took them away to kiss yet once again his tear-stained cheeks, and then with quick steps hurried from the room. Alexey Alexandrovitch met her at the door. When he saw her, he stopped and bowed his head. Though she had declared a moment before that he was better and more upright than she, the swift glance that she gave him, taking in his whole person, with all its peculiarities, awoke in her only a feeling of hatred and scorn for him, and jealousy on account of her son. She hurriedly lowered her veil, and, quickening her steps, almost ran from the room. She had entirely forgotten in her haste the playthings which she had bought with so much love and sadness, and she took them back with her to the hotel.